A TV commercial circulating for weeks says there's an urgent need for 100 beautiful brides. That's Uyghur brides for Chinese men. Those that participate will be rewarded, but what's the motive? The word China may bring to mind bustling cities like Shanghai and Beijing, but a political campaign has revealed the country's striking poverty. 3 full pages of a newspaper taken up with criticism of U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It's the strongest ever reaction by the Chinese Communist Party to a Western politician. And a U.S. professor who worked with NASA has been arrested for hiding his ties to China. Each year, the Chinese regime costs the U.S. $200 to $600 billion in stolen trade secrets, counterfeit goods, and pirated software. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has for 3 months left to lift the entire country of China out of poverty. That's to fulfill an order he made 5 years ago. In trying to achieve this, local officials took some radical measures. NTD's Juliet Song reports.
A former Chinese state official says China should hold off calling itself a well-off society this year. But failing to realize this goal would be a big blow to the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, as he has been pushing for it for the past 5 years. In 2015, Xi urged officials nationwide to be sure to bring all Chinese people out of poverty by the end of 2020. Now there are 3 months left until the deadline, but almost half of the Chinese population is still making less than $150 a month on average. China is the world's second largest economy right now, but it also has one of the world's highest income inequality. Officials who fail to lift locals out of poverty face setbacks in careers. To meet the quota, some took to extreme measures. That's according to a report from Bitter Winter, a magazine on human rights in China. In 2019, in China's central Henan province, a woman in her 90s hung herself in her house. Her neighbor told Bitter Winter that, the day before, local officials forced the woman to move out of her home. They did that so they can meet the quota of poverty alleviation. The woman said she had no place to go. The officials also forced 25 other seniors out of their homes. A farmer from China's Hebei province told Bitter Winter her story. She said the Chinese regime's anti-poverty policy has driven them to the point of selling their blood to sustain their lives. One of the standards for lifting someone out of poverty is that they must have a proper home. To meet the quota, she said local officials forced her family to move from their own shelter to a new home. But the new home was not livable as it had no doors or windows. Local authorities refused to pay for these expenses, and so they had to borrow over $4,000 to renovate the house. At that time, they didn't even have money for food. As a last resort, her sick husband went to sell his blood for money. She told Bitter Winter, crying, "We can barely sustain our basic lives, and the government is forcing us to our death. I know extracting blood is bad for our health, but we have no other means to sustain our lives." The authorities put up a notice in her home saying that she was provided over $2,000 in subsidies. The woman said she didn't get a penny. China's state mouthpiece People's Daily published an article this Tuesday boasting how authorities successfully lifted people out of poverty in a village in southern Guangxi. But the report also reveals the village's striking poverty. Until 2018, locals didn't have tap water. Just this year, villagers were able to get bathrooms inside their homes. A local elementary school didn't even have blackboards, so they used the stone walls after painting it with cement and ink. In March, Xi Jinping said the goal of lifting the rural population out of poverty has to be realized in time, and there's no retreat or flexibility. Juliet Song, NTD News.
Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping's Clean Plate campaign is calling for the country to save food. But people in China say the politically funded feasts and banquets enjoyed by CCP officials are the biggest food waste of all. This is a decades-long problem in China. Xi launched a similar campaign 7 years ago, aimed at ending officials' extravagant feasts on the public's dime. According to Chinese media, more than $40 billion of public funds were used for dinner parties and banquets for officials in 2012. The food waste generated by these events could reportedly feed 200 million people. Data shows that this figure actually increased in 2015 despite Xi's 2013 campaign. Officials' dinner tables have become an arena for exchanging power and profit. Official inspections serve as one common trigger for the feasts. An insider revealed that eating and drinking takes up 80% of authorities' inspection work, adding that the rest is merely formality. According to CCP policy, inspection teams will occasionally visit grassroots organizations to perform various inspections. Common inspections include annual inspections, goals inspections, political performance evaluations, and project inspections. But during the so-called inspections, officials quickly flip through some documents, listen to briefs, and then impose some requirements. With that finished, the majority of the time dedicated to the inspection will be used to host a dinner party. The extravagance of the banquet has even become a criteria used to judge the inspection results. Some CCP officials appear to regard eating lavish food as a major life goal. One example of this comes from a former public security director who was sentenced to death for bribery. His last words were, "I've almost tasted everything, but unfortunately I had no chance to try Louis XIII, and I never will." He was referring to a rare and expensive variety of cognac. As the food waste control measures tighten, the loopholes and countermeasures are getting craftier. According to Chinese state-run media, luxury dining rooms are hidden inside the cafeterias of government institutions and state-owned enterprises. The rooms reportedly have considerably better facilities than even most top-level restaurants, and their secretive locations make them easier to conceal. Reporting by Xu Wenhui, NTD News. The Chinese Communist Party's media criticized U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo again, but this time with increased intensity. Experts said this is because Pompeo hit the point.
On Tuesday, the media mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party, People's Daily, criticized Secretary of State Mike Pompeo across 3 full pages of his paper, and with an intensity rarely seen before. They were refuting Pompeo's speech point by point. Pompeo gave his speech titled Communist China and the Free World's Future a month ago at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in California. In his speech, Pompeo talked about the biggest lie of the Communist Party.
If there's one thing I learned, communists almost always lie. The biggest lie that they tell is to think that they speak for 1.4 billion people who are surveilled, oppressed, and scared to speak out.
The People's Daily article claimed the Chinese Communist Party has no interest of its own. Everything it does is for the people. The article also boasted that the CCP had achieved success in the fight against the epidemic and that it had lifted people out of poverty to become rich and lead a happy life. It also criticized the seriousness of the epidemic in the United States and said the people's lives there are in dire straits. Lan Shu, a U.S.-based China affairs analyst, said Pompeo's speech struck the root of the CCP, and this is why the CCP reacted so strongly. He added that the article was written not for showing the outside world, but for further brainwashing the Chinese people.
实际上它的主要的目的还是想给中国人洗脑。
In fact, its purpose is to brainwash the Chinese people. It cannot hold back the wave of claims from outside of China. Instead, the CCP is creating the public opinion at home to strengthen the control over Chinese people and society, so as to achieve the purpose of consolidating its rule.
Last month, a number of Trump administration officials spoke on the topic of China, criticizing the CCP's ideology and global ambitions. Last week, after Pompeo concluded his visit to the 4 countries of Central and Eastern Europe, he tweeted that Americans recognize that the CCP, which is totally separate from the Chinese people, threatens their values and way of life. Both parties in Washington know what we are up against. The tide has turned. Just as I see it turning across Europe and the world, the West is winning.
Wuhan's situation seems much better now than back in February or March, when the CCP virus was prevalent. But Wuhan citizens are still concerned about it. A Wuhan citizen was recorded on a bus commenting on the epidemic.
As the people of Wuhan, everybody in Wuhan knows, all the people in Wuhan know, it is something that can exterminate mankind. The Communist Party dare not admit that. It will be attacked by the whole world and will be punished by the whole world. Chinese people are resented all over the world. Who is responsible? People say this is a natural disaster, and the people of Wuhan say it's definitely not a natural disaster, but a man-made disaster.
A new report by Chinese media Caixin Global delves into Chinese property developers tied to one of the biggest real estate corruption scandals in Los Angeles. The in-depth report investigated the two firms suspected by U.S. federal agents, Shenzhen New World Group and Shenzhen Hazen's Real Estate Group. It found Shenzhen New World Group already had a trail of corruption inquiries in China. That's according to Chinese court documents seen by Caixin. Businessman Huang Wei, who founded and controls the company, came under formal investigation in 2016 when Zhang Shiming, a former land resources chief in Shenzhen, was investigated for corruption. Huang was never charged, while Zhang was charged and sentenced to 11 months in jail for bribery. Shenzhen Hazen's is owned by businessman Yuan Fu. The two firms came under investigation last year when Los Angeles council member Jose Huizar was indicted on more than 30 charges related to a $1.5 million bribery and corruption scheme he allegedly ran out of the city hall. According to the indictment, Huizar allegedly accepted more than $800,000 from an individual called Chairman Yi, described as a Chinese billionaire who runs a multinational development firm and who owns a hotel in Huizar's district. A 2018 FBI raid of Huizar's home found nearly $130,000 in cash. According to the indictment, he received the money from a Chinese billionaire and another business person seeking favors from him. According to real estate news site The Real Deal, Shenzhen New World is one of the firms working with Huizar. Shenzhen New World denied any link to Huizar in a July statement, while Hazen's declined to comment. Huizar is the fifth person charged in the investigation. The other four have pleaded guilty earlier this year to various charges. Huizar pleaded not guilty to bribery, money laundering, and an array of other charges on August 3rd. But lawyers for both sides recommended that the trial continue. According to documents, it's due to the large amount of evidence and the grand jury expecting more defendants to appear. The new date for Huizar's trial is set for next June. A Texas engineering professor who also worked with NASA has been arrested for hiding his ties to China. His NASA contract prohibited him from collaborating with China or any Chinese company or university.
A Texas A&M University professor has been arrested and charged for concealing his ties to China while working for NASA. Engineering professor Chung Jong-dong was arrested on August 23rd and charged with conspiracy, wire fraud, and making false statements. Prosecutors allege that Chung purposely hid his ties to Chinese state-backed organizations while leading a NASA research team that received a grant from the organization. The Justice Department says that under NASA's grant terms, he was not allowed to work with Chinese institutions. Prosecutors say Chung had access to NASA resources related to the International Space Station and leveraged that to advance his standing at a Chinese university. According to prosecutors, he participated in 2 Chinese talent plans and also applied for the 1,000 Talents plan at a university in Hefei. The DOJ complaint says Chung lied to both his university and NASA about these connections. US officials have warned that programs like these incentivize foreign researchers to transfer technology and information to China. Chung faces a maximum sentence of 30 years in prison if found guilty on all 3 charges.
The FBI is warning corporate America about the risks of doing business with the Chinese regime. A new report details the threats and ways to counter the communist regime on the home front. It also exposes how the Chinese regime has been stealing U.S. tech secrets from businesses to universities. The Chinese Regime State Council has stated the 4 steps China uses to gain a technological edge over other countries. The steps are introducing foreign tech knowledge to China, understanding the materials used, assimilating that knowledge by reverse engineering it, and finally re-innovating that knowledge to develop what it calls new state-of-the-art technology. To do that, China targets U.S. businesses and their employees through academic exchanges and state-sponsored spying. The FBI advises companies to monitor and secure the local area network, saying it's the top vector for insider threat exploitation. That's followed by physical and remote access. Each year, the Chinese regime costs the U.S. $200 to $600 billion in stolen trade secrets, counterfeit goods, and pirated software. The FBI warns that the CCP does not play by the same rules. That's because its goal is to equal or surpass the U.S. as a global superpower. The CCP wants to influence the world with a value system shaped by undemocratic authoritarian ideals. While U.S. businesses labor under the assumption of mutual benefit, the Chinese regime does not. Instead, it takes advantage of every opportunity to develop and maintain a strategic economic edge. The FBI also warns of China's Made in China 2025 plan. In it, China aims to produce 70% of components in 10 domestic Chinese industries, greatly reducing reliance on foreign-made goods by 2025. Some ways American companies can protect themselves include developing a security strategy, taking precautions on foreign travel, and monitoring foreigner visits, as well as malicious cyber activity. The FBI adds that security violations or cyber intrusions should always be reported to the company's security office or local FBI office, saying when in doubt, report the incident, but never to the person under suspicion. U.S. and Chinese trade officials have reaffirmed their commitment to Phase 1 of the current trade deal on a phone call on Monday. China is lagging in its obligations to buy American goods, but the recent pledge has given confidence to the financial markets.
The US and China say they're still committed to the Phase 1 trade deal. China is way behind on its commitments.
As of June, for instance, we know Chinese purchases were less than 1/3 predicted in energy, a little bit over 1/3 predicted in agricultural goods, and about half, which is about half on manufacturing goods.
But it seems the US is still willing to work with them, a written statement calling the meeting progress. But Professor Colares is skeptical about China's desire to fill their promise. He thinks they're taking advantage of the fact it's an election year.
They have taken advantage of the U.S. electoral calendar, right? They're trying to delay Chinese commitments. They're trying to delay purchases that they had committed to making under the Phase 1 deal.
Colares says China may be waiting for better terms after the election should Trump lose. Bloomberg said China will need to buy out $130 billion of goods in the second half of the year to meet their obligations.
Many people believe that once recovered from the CCP virus, the body's immune system will develop antibodies to fight the virus and reinfection won't be possible. But according to an expert from Hong Kong, that assumption should not be made.
Scientists in Hong Kong have confirmed the first known reinfection of the CCP virus. Now, a patient in the Netherlands and another one in Belgium have also been reinfected. According to Belgian virologist Mark van Ronst, the antibodies the patients developed in the first case were not strong enough to fend off an infection from a slightly different variation of the virus. The virus that caused the second infection for the Belgian patient is similar to the one that caused the first one, but it has evolved since. This also makes the development of a vaccine harder.
That's what they do every day. Viruses mutate, and that means that a potential vaccine is not going to be a vaccine that will last forever or even for 10 years, probably not even 5 years.
He added that the vaccine has to be redesigned regularly. Another expert from Hong Kong who was involved in the first reinfection said people shouldn't think that they will have lifelong immunity after having been infected once. Just recently, the FDA authorized the use of blood plasma from patients who have recovered from the virus as a treatment for the disease. Survivors of the virus are generally left with blood containing antibodies. The blood component that carries the antibodies can be collected and given to newly infected patients. But there has not been much evidence to show how well this treatment works. Especially with the 3 recorded reinfections so far, it becomes even more questionable.
A TV commercial filmed not in Chinese but in the Uyghur ethnic group's native language is calling for 100 Uyghur brides to marry Han Chinese males. It's an answer to the Chinese Communist Party's call for promoting ethnic unity. Human rights activists say the purpose is to eradicate Uyghur culture. The commercial has been circulating for weeks, advertising an urgent need for 100 beautiful brides. The commercial begins with a show of gratitude for the CCP, which the commercial says has given the Uyghur people a good life. It then urges Uyghurs to support the CCP's goal of increasing Uyghur Han marriages for the purpose of so-called promoting national and ethnic unity. The commercial adds that viewers are welcome to introduce your friends and family, and even states that those who agree to the marriages will be rewarded with large sums of money. The 30-second commercial first appeared on Douyin, the Chinese version of TikTok, but it was soon deleted after overseas Uyghur human rights activists launched a campaign against it. Later, the activists posted the video on Facebook and Twitter to spread the word. They say the video makes Beijing's goals clear to eradicate the unique Uyghur culture. The CCP's promotion of marriage between Uyghurs and Han Chinese people also surfaced back in August 2014. A local government sector in Xinjiang gave incentives to interracial families. Among the benefits were annual bonuses of around $1,500, free education, and favorable employment and residency treatment for the couple's parents and children. When introducing the incentives, the former local CCP chairman said it was to promote positive energy. China's 2000 and 2010 national population census show that Xinjiang has the lowest rate of interracial marriages among ethnic minorities. Up next, we introduce a new segment designed to help shed light on Chinese terms and phenomenon not well known in the West. Today's topic, Tibet, and how under the guise of democratic reform, the Chinese Communist Party has a history of imposing its will on the region. The Dalai Lama, Tibetan spiritual leader, has lived in exile for more than half a century. Today, Tibetans can be prosecuted simply for sharing a photo of him on social media. Beijing formally announced the ban in 1996, publishing a notice in newspaper Tibet Daily. The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, declared all photos of the Dalai Lama, as well as other religious artifacts, were forbidden. The region of Tibet is home to deeply rooted cultural traditions. Before the CCP took power, generations of Tibetans enjoyed their peaceful, religion-dominated way of life and high degree of autonomy. According to their belief system, the Dalai Lama is the incarnation of Buddha or God. Forcing a Tibetan Buddhist to denounce the Dalai Lama would be equivalent to forcing a devoted Christian to condemn Jesus Christ. Yet that's only one of the many ways Beijing represses their traditional culture. In 1950, 1 year after the Communist Party seized control of China, the Chinese military, called the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, began attacking Tibet. Aiming to take over the region, the PLA easily defeated the poorly equipped Tibetan army. A year after that, in 1951, Tibetans were forced to sign a 17-point agreement. In it, the party promised to uphold Tibet's autonomy. But as Chinese military power grew in the region, Tibetans found it harder to maintain their way of life. Soon after, Tibetans founded the Tibetan People's Conference, or TPC, in hopes of making Tibetans' voices heard. The group also sought dialogue with the PLA and urged Beijing to respect their agreement over Tibetans' autonomy. Soon after, Beijing threatened the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan people with extremely negative consequences if the group didn't disband. The TPC later dissolved under the pressure. Its leaders were imprisoned, where some died. Beijing continued to push its intrusive domination and its so-called democratic reform across Tibet. Something made easier by building 2 major roads through the region. They were used to transport supplies directly to the PLA station there and push the Tibetan resistance to a breaking point. The CCP's so-called reform divided Tibetans into social classes and encouraged the poor to hate and steal from the rich. A party official once explained that the regime aims to destroy the relations between the influential figures and the masses of Tibetans. Resentment over the CCP's rule grew increasingly stronger as time went on. As the situation worsened and as more Tibetans fought back, the PLA began to regularly send in the army to slaughter what they called rebel bandits. On March 29, 1956, the PLA aimed the bombers at the Litang Temple, one of the largest in Tibet, and completely destroyed it. More than 2,000 Tibetans were killed in the attack. 2 years later, in May of 1958, some 7,500 fleeing Tibetans arrived at an area alongside the Yellow River, hoping for a peaceful life across the water. But little did they know, a brutal slaughter was waiting for them. A Chinese official working in Tibet witnessed the slaughter and recorded it in his book, A Civil War That Got Lost. We couldn't distinguish the armed rebel bandits from the ordinary people, people carrying guns, waving Buddhist beads and streamers, driving cows and horses, and holding babies were all mixed together. They desperately surged toward the Yellow River's shore, but were greeted by troops' machine guns. Soon bodies began floating along the river, with streams of blood dissolving into the water. Another tragic war took place near a mountain stream in Qinghai province, a major province on the Tibetan plateau. Li Jianling, an independent scholar who specializes in Tibetan history, estimates that the PLA dispatched bombers and around 9,000 soldiers to slaughter Tibetans. After the attack, the troops didn't even bother to clean up the battlefield and left the dead bodies there to rot. The wars and subsequent famine killed nearly half of the Tibetan population. Since late 1950, the CCP has been arresting Tibetan men between the ages of 18 to 60 in some areas in order to avoid unrest or organized rebellion. According to a 1962 state media internal reference, some regions where the Tibetans reside have a ratio of young men to women at more than 1 to 7, and in some places more than 1 to 10. The lack of men and boys made it hard for Tibetans to survive natural disasters and for their population to grow. Last year, on November 26th, a 24-year-old Tibetan died after a self-immolation protest. He is the 155th Tibetan self-immolation case seen publicly within the past decade. The exiled Tibetan government says 1.2 million Tibetans have died of starvation, violence, or other reasons since the Communist Party took over. Over 6,000 Tibetan Buddhist monasteries have also been destroyed. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.